They threw me out of my own home on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the sky weeping tears I was too shocked to cry myself. I stood shivering on the perfectly manicured lawn George and I had planted together 45 years earlier, clutching a single suitcase containing the fragments of my life they'd deemed worthy of saving. Through the pouring rain, I watched strangers carry out my history. The antique dresser George had lovingly restored, the dining table where we'd shared thousands of meals, the boxes of family photos documenting a lifetime of love and memories. My son Daniel and his wife Vanessa stood side by side on the porch we'd built together when Daniel was just a boy, their arms crossed like sentinels guarding a fortress they'd stolen right out from under me. "It's for your own good, Mom," Daniel repeated, his voice flat and rehearsed, a hollow echo of the loving son I'd raised. He couldn't meet my eyes, staring instead at the moving men carrying out my grandmother's china. Vanessa offered one of her polished, empty smiles, her designer raincoat protecting her from the downpour that soaked through my thin jacket. "Sunset Gardens has wonderful activities and plenty of people your age," she said brightly, as if discussing a holiday resort rather than discarding me like yesterday's news. Rain dripped from my hair onto my cheeks, mixing with the tears I refused to let them see fall. I memorized their faces in that moment. Daniel's shame-filled avoidance, Vanessa's cold triumph. This is the story of how the woman they thought was weak and defeated fought back against her own flesh and blood, and how I systematically reclaimed everything they'd stolen from me. The retirement home smelled like antiseptic and forgotten promises, a sterile scent that clung to everything from the hallways to the cafeteria food. My room, they called it a suite, though it was smaller than my old walk-in closet, was a beige box with a narrow bed, a plastic-covered armchair, and a window overlooking a concrete courtyard where other residents shuffled slowly along paved paths. I sat on the stiff mattress, my hands trembling as I remembered my sun-filled kitchen where George would make coffee every morning, the creaky third step on the staircase he'd always meant to fix, the window seat where I'd read bedtime stories to Daniel until we both fell asleep there. Just yesterday, Vanessa had supervised as workers packed my wedding china, the delicate blue set George and I had chosen together, into cardboard boxes marked "Donate" in bold black letters. Daniel had stood by silently, watching them take down family photos from the walls, including the one of him as a toddler sitting on George's shoulders. "The house is too much maintenance for you, Mom," he'd claimed, though I'd maintained it perfectly fine since George's passing 3 years ago. "Vanessa and I need the space to start our family properly." Our family. The words had cut deeper than any eviction notice, excluding me from the very family I'd created. That first endless night, surrounded by the ghost-like sounds of coughing and distant televisions, I cried until my throat was raw, until grief turned to something harder, something sharper that settled deep in my bones. By morning, as pale light filtered through the cheap blinds, a fire had ignited in my soul, a burning determination that would soon become an inferno of revenge. My only remaining possession from my old life was George's worn leather steamer trunk, the one that had traveled with us on countless adventures from Paris to Tokyo, each scratch and scuff marking a cherished memory. The retirement home staff had barely managed to squeeze it into my room, and now it sat at the foot of my bed like a silent promise. As morning sunlight struggled through the cheap blinds, I ran my hands over its familiar surface, remembering how George had always been the practical one, the planner who thought 3 steps ahead. "Always have an escape route, my love," he'd told me once during a thunderstorm when the lights went out, his eyes serious in the candlelight. Especially from situations that seemed too good to be true. My fingers found the nearly invisible seam along the trunk's bottom, the secret compartment he'd shown me one rainy afternoon years ago, swearing me to secrecy. With trembling hands, I worked the hidden latch until it clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the silent room. Inside, nestled beside his old journals and what felt like maps, lay a sealed envelope addressed to me in his familiar, looping handwriting. My breath caught in my throat, tears springing to my eyes. It was as if he'd reached across the years from beyond the grave, knowing I would need him now more than ever. But what could this letter possibly contain that would help me against the cold legal documents and colder hearts that had stolen my home and my dignity? The answer would change everything. The letter smelled faintly of George's pipe tobacco, a scent that brought immediate, comforting tears to my eyes as I carefully broke the seal. The paper was thick and expensive, just like he'd always preferred. "My dearest Evelyn," it began, and I could almost hear his voice, warm and steady, reading the words to me. "If you're reading this, then my worst fears have been realized, and I'm so sorry you're facing this alone." My hands shook as I read his words describing his deep concerns about Daniel. How our son had always been easily influenced by flashy things and smooth talkers. How he worried about Vanessa's calculating nature and the way she eyed our house with possessive hunger. George had suspected they might try to take the house someday, using my grief and loneliness against me. "Find Arthur Pendleton," the letter instructed, the ink slightly darker where he'd pressed down hard. "My old business partner. He has the documents that will protect you when I cannot." Documents? What documents could possibly protect me now that the house was legally theirs? And who was Arthur Pendleton? I vaguely remembered George's old business partner from their construction days, though I hadn't seen him in nearly a decade. The letter ended with words that strengthened my resolve. "Be strong, my love. You are far more capable than they know. Fight for our home." I looked around my tiny, beige room, the paper feeling like a weapon in my hands, the first real hope I'd felt since they'd pushed me out my own front door. The game, I realized with a grim smile, had just changed entirely. Arthur Pendleton's office was located in a beautiful old building downtown that smelled wonderfully of polished wood and history. A stark contrast to the sterile retirement home. He rose from behind his massive oak desk when I entered, his kind eyes filled with immediate recognition and sympathy. "Evelyn," he said, taking my hands in his warm, papery ones. "George told me this day might come, though I prayed it wouldn't." He guided me to a comfortable leather chair, his office filled with photographs of construction projects and family, a life fully lived. He listened patiently as I poured out the painful story, the manipulation about building me a granny flat, the false promises, the cruel eviction, the way they'd packed my life into boxes as if none of it mattered. When I finished, Arthur's expression was grim, his lips pressed into a thin line. He moved to an ancient green safe in the corner, working the combination with practiced ease. The heavy door swung open with a solid thunk to reveal neat stacks of documents in various boxes. "George was smarter than all of them," Arthur said, pulling out a thick folder tied with faded red ribbon. "When we bought that land together 40 years ago, he insisted on an unusual arrangement." He untied the ribbon and spread the documents before me. "The house itself belongs to Daniel," Arthur explained, his finger pointing to the relevant lines. "But the land beneath it? That has always been yours, Evelyn. George never transferred the land when he put the house in Daniel's name for tax purposes." The revelation hit me like a physical blow, leaving me breathless. They owned the house, but I owned the very ground it stood on. And in that moment, staring at the legal documents that proved my power, I suddenly knew exactly how I would make them pay for their betrayal. The first shot in my war was a formally worded letter from my new lawyer, Miss Jenkins, a sharp, compassionate woman Arthur had recommended. The document stated in clear, uncompromising legal language that Daniel and Vanessa were trespassing on my property and demanded they pay substantial ground rent, retroactive for the entire year they'd lived there since pushing me out. The amount was carefully calculated to be exactly what would strain their finances to the breaking point. I imagined their faces when they opened that certified letter, the confusion turning to panic as they realized their secure little world was built on sand. 2 days later, my simple flip phone began ringing incessantly, vibrating across my small nightstand with frantic energy. Daniel's number flashed across the screen 17 times that first morning before I finally answered on the 18th call. "Mom, what is this?" he demanded, his voice shrill with panic. "This has to be some kind of mistake. The lawyer must have the wrong property." I kept my voice calm, though my heart raced with a mixture of nerves and triumph. "No mistake, Daniel," I said evenly. You should have read the fine print more carefully, or perhaps you should have treated your mother with more respect. I heard Vanessa shrieking in the background, her voice sharp and hysterical, before I calmly hung up. They thought they'd won when they took my house. They had no idea the real battle had just begun, and I held all the weapons. The community turned against them with a speed that surprised even me, a testament to the loyalty of old friends and the power of truth. I didn't have to say much, just shared my story quietly with Mary at our favorite coffee shop, with Tom at the grocery store produce section, with Susan from my old book club at the library. I let my genuine sadness show, the raw emotion of a mother betrayed, and people responded with immediate outrage on my behalf. Soon, Daniel and Vanessa found themselves facing cold shoulders at neighborhood gatherings and whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when they approached. The local bakery where Vanessa had been a regular suddenly never had her favorite almond croissants, always just sold out. Parents at the elementary school where she'd chaired fundraising events stopped returning her calls, their children suddenly too busy for playdates with Dean. Meanwhile, the financial pressure mounted relentlessly. The ground rent was crippling, and with late fees accumulating daily, they were sinking fast beneath a debt they couldn't escape. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine about their screaming matches that echoed through open windows, the expensive furniture and electronics appearing on their curb with "for sale" signs, the desperation growing in their eyes. They were learning exactly what it felt like to have their security torn away, to lie awake at night wondering how they would survive. And I, watching from the sidelines with my newfound power, was just getting started on my path of calculated revenge. The breaking point came on a stormy October evening when the wind howled like a wounded animal and rain lashed against my window in relentless sheets. I was reading in my room when the front desk called. Daniel was here, demanding to see me immediately. I found him in the visitor's lounge, soaked through and shaking, his expensive clothes hanging loosely on his suddenly thin frame. Water pooled around his designer shoes on the linoleum floor. "She left me," he choked out, rainwater dripping from his hair onto his pale face. "Vanessa took Dean and went to her parents. She said she can't handle the humiliation or the debt anymore." He collapsed into a plastic chair, sobbing like the little boy who'd skinned his knee on our driveway years ago, when a hug and a bandage could fix anything. "I've lost everything because of my own stupidity, my weakness." I sat with him as he cried, my own heart torn violently between maternal instinct and remembered betrayal. This was what I wanted, wasn't it? For them to feel my pain, my powerlessness? But seeing my son broken and alone, his life in ruins, I realized revenge wasn't as sweet as I'd imagined it would be. The fire of anger that had sustained me for months suddenly felt cold and empty. The question now, as I watched my only child weep with regret, was what would I do with the absolute power I now held over his future? I sat with Daniel for nearly an hour as the storm raged outside, watching the man I'd raised crumble before my eyes. He confessed everything between ragged sobs, how Vanessa had pressured him constantly about the house, how she'd manipulated him into believing that putting me in a home was the modern, responsible thing to do, how she'd threatened to leave him and take Dean if he didn't go along with her plans. "I was weak, Mom," he admitted, staring at his trembling hands. "I knew it was wrong, but I let her convince me. I thought we could always reverse it if it didn't work out." He cried even harder when he described how Dean kept asking when he could see Grandma again, how confused and sad our grandson was by all the fighting and sudden changes. I listened, really listened for the first time since this nightmare began, and I realized that while Vanessa might have been the architect of this disaster, Daniel had been the willing contractor, too concerned with keeping his new wife happy to protect his own mother. Still, he was my son, and his genuine, gut-wrenching remorse began to soften the hard edges of my anger. When he finally left, promising to return the next day, I lay awake all night, torn between the satisfaction of victory and the painful reality of what that victory had cost us all. The legal proceedings continued despite Daniel's personal crisis, the machinery of the law grinding forward with cold, impersonal efficiency. Miss Jenkins presented me with their formal response to our latest legal maneuver, a desperate attempt to have the ground rent declared excessive, which she assured me would fail given the specific statutes and precedents in our state. "They're grasping at straws now, Evelyn," she said, her confident tone both reassuring and somehow sad. Meanwhile, Arthur had been quietly investigating their financial situation and discovered they were on the verge of bankruptcy, with multiple maxed-out credit cards and a second mortgage taken out against the house. They were living far beyond their means. He told me over tea in his office, his kind eyes filled with concern. The house was their only real asset, and without clear title to the land, it's essentially worthless on the market. I thought of little Dean caught in the middle of all this, financial chaos, shuttled between warring parents and an uncertain future. That's when I knew what I had to do, what George would have wanted me to do. I asked Miss Jenkins to draft one final offer, one that would end the legal battle but ensure justice was served in a way that honored George's memory and protected what really mattered. Our family's future, or what was left of it. The meeting took place in Miss Jenkins' sunny office exactly 1 week later, the same bright room where we'd begun this journey months earlier. Daniel arrived alone, looking nervous but sober, dressed in a simple button-down shirt rather than his usual expensive suit. He looked like the college boy I remembered, stripped of the pretentiousness Vanessa had cultivated in him. Miss Jenkins laid out the terms clearly and compassionately. I would forgive all the ground rent debt and sign over the land to him permanently. In return, he would immediately sign the main house back over to me. He could continue living in the granny flat, the proper one we would build together, not the shed-like structure Vanessa had ordered, with generous visitation rights to see Dean there. The house itself would be placed in a protective trust for Dean's future, with me having full use of it during my lifetime. Daniel listened quietly, his shoulders slumping further with each term, but he didn't argue or protest. When Miss Jenkins finished, he looked at me with red-rimmed eyes, the ghost of the little boy I'd loved so dearly visible in his tired face. "I don't deserve this kindness, Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Then he picked up the pen and signed without another word of argument, the scratch of ink on paper marking the end of our painful war and the uncertain beginning of whatever would come next for our fractured family. Walking back through my front door for the first time in nearly a year felt like coming up for air after being trapped underwater for too long. The house smelled different. Vanessa's heavy floral perfume had replaced the familiar scents of lemon polish and George's pipe tobacco, but the bones were the same. The soul of our home still intact beneath the superficial changes she'd made. I moved slowly through each room, my fingers tracing the familiar patterns in the woodwork George had carved, the slight dip in the hallway floorboards that he'd always meant to fix, the window seat where I'd read to Daniel when he was small. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Reliable contractors came to begin proper construction on a real granny flat at the side of the house, not shoved in the backyard like an afterthought. I hired a careful team to pack up Vanessa's remaining belongings, storing them neatly in the garage for Daniel to deal with when he was ready. With each of her cold, modern decorations I removed, the house felt more like mine again. Until one golden afternoon, I stood in the freshly painted living room. My own furniture returned to its proper places, sunlight streaming through the clean windows, and felt the first real peace I'd known since before George died. Daniel moved into the finished granny flat 6 weeks later, a quiet, humbled version of the man he'd been. The space was bright and comfortable, with its own small kitchen, bedroom, and living area. Far nicer than the retirement home, though the psychological distance between the main house and his new quarters felt vast at first. We established new routines slowly, carefully, like dancers learning new steps after a long separation. He went back to work at his accounting firm, and I began the process of turning the main house back into a home rather than just a building. At first, we spoke only when necessary, our conversations practical and brief, discussions about utility bills, maintenance schedules, when he would see Dean next. But gradually, over shared meals on Sunday evenings and occasional conversations on the porch as summer turned to fall, We began to find our way back to each other. He started helping with small repairs around the house, using skills his father had taught him that he'd seemingly forgotten during his years with Vanessa. I saw glimpses of the son I remembered, the one who cared about people more than appearances, who found satisfaction in working with his hands rather than accumulating expensive things. The real turning point came with Dean's visits, which began as supervised outings and gradually became regular weekends filled with laughter and healing. At first, Vanessa would drop him off at the end of the driveway, never getting out of her car, never meeting my eyes through the window where I watched. But Dean would come running up the familiar path, his small face alight with pure joy, shouting, "Grandma's house!" as he burst through the front door, just as his father had done at that age. Having him back in the home where his father had grown up, building new memories in the same rooms, healed something in both Daniel and me that words never could. We'd sit together at the old kitchen table, the three of us, eating chocolate chip cookies and laughing at Dean's stories from school, and for brief, precious moments, it almost felt like a real family again. Daniel began joining us for these simple moments, at first hesitantly, then with growing comfort, until one evening he looked at me across the table, Dean chattering happily between us, and said, "I'm sorry, Mom. Really, truly sorry." And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I looked into my son's eyes and believed him completely. As the seasons changed from fall to winter, so did our relationship, evolving into something new and surprisingly strong. Daniel started attending counseling to address what he called his pattern of passive compliance, and we began having real conversations about what had happened, not just the legal battle over the house, but the years leading up to it, the small betrayals and compromises that had eroded our relationship long before the eviction. He admitted how empty his life with Vanessa had been, how he'd felt trapped but at the perfect image they presented to the world, but unable to escape it. I shared how lonely I'd been after George died, how Daniel's withdrawal had felt like losing my last connection to the life we'd built together. We didn't solve everything in these conversations. Some wounds run too deep for quick healing, but we began to understand each other again, to see the hurt and fear behind our own actions rather than just the hurt we'd caused each other. The house, which had been a source of such conflict, became a place of healing, its walls witnessing our slow, careful reconciliation. The legal process to secure Dean's future proceeded smoothly under Miss Jenkins' careful, compassionate guidance. We established an irrevocable trust that would grant him ownership of both the house and land when he turned 25, with clear provisions allowing me to live there for my natural life and Daniel to remain in the granny flat as long as he maintained a healthy, active relationship with his son. Creating this legacy for my grandson felt like the final, perfect tribute to George's memory and his foresight, ensuring that the home he'd loved and built would shelter future generations of our family, protected from the kind of short-sighted decisions that had nearly lost it forever. When I signed the trust documents in Miss Jenkins' office, with Daniel sitting beside me, I felt George's presence so strongly it was as if he were standing behind me, his hands on my shoulders, approving of the circle I'd closed, the family I'd protected, the home I'd saved from greed and saved for love. Today, as I write this final chapter, the first snow of winter is falling outside my kitchen window, dusting the familiar backyard in a soft blanket of white, transforming the garden George loved into something magical and new. Daniel is in the granny flat preparing for Dean's weekend visit while I'm baking the chocolate chip cookies my grandson loves. The kitchen filled with that wonderful homey scent of butter and chocolate. The house is quiet, but not empty, filled with the peaceful certainty that comes from weathering terrible storms and surviving, even thriving afterward. Daniel and I will never have the simple, trusting relationship we had before Vanessa, before the eviction, before the legal battle that divided us. That particular innocence is lost forever, swept away by betrayal and the hard lessons we both learned. But what we've built in its place is stronger in some ways, forged in the fires of betrayal and forgiveness, tempered by hard-won understanding and mutual respect. He's dating someone new now, a kind art teacher from Dean's school who cares more about people than possessions. and I can see the change in him. He's lighter, more present, more like the son I raised before he lost his way in the pursuit of someone else's idea of perfection. Sometimes, when I'm working in the garden George and I planted together so many years ago, I think about the strange, painful journey that brought me here. From betrayed mother to determined fighter to forgiving parent, each transformation leaving its mark on my soul. The white-hot anger that fueled me through the darkest days has faded now, replaced by a quiet gratitude for the unexpected lessons learned through the struggle. I'm teaching Dean the names of the flowers his grandfather loved, showing him how to carefully tend the rose bushes George nurtured from cuttings, passing on the love for this piece of earth that binds our family together across generations. Daniel joins us sometimes on these gardening days, his hands in the rich soil, reconnecting with the home and the values he'd once been willing to sacrifice for a shallow version of happiness. In these simple moments, with dirt on our hands and the winter sun on our faces, we're not a broken family trying to pick up the pieces. We're something new, something stronger and more real, built on the solid foundation of what survived when everything else fell apart. The house itself feels different now. Not a museum frozen in the past, but a living, breathing home again, filled with present joy and future promise. Dean's colorful artwork covers the refrigerator. His small, muddy boots sit by the back door. His infectious laughter echoes in the hallways where his father's once did. Daniel and I have started new traditions that honor both our past and our hard-won present. Friday night dinners where we take turns cooking, Sunday mornings reading the paper together in the living room, the simple, ordinary rhythms of family life that had been missing for so long. The granny flat is no longer a symbol of Daniel's exile, but has become his true home, a place where he's rebuilding his life on his own terms, with the security of knowing he has a real family and a real home, just steps away when he needs it. Something he'll never take for granted again. As I look out at the sunset painting the winter sky in breathtaking shades of orange and purple, the same view George and I cherished together for 45 years, I feel a deep, abiding peace settle in my soul. The journey back to this moment was longer, more painful, and more transformative than I could have ever imagined, but it led me here, to a home reclaimed, a son redeemed, a grandson's future secured, and myself rediscovered. The true victory isn't in the legal documents or the returned property, but in the profound healing that came after the battle, in the hard-earned understanding that some bonds can survive even the deepest betrayals if both sides are willing to do the difficult work of forgiveness and change. George's love protected me when I couldn't protect myself, and my love for our family guided me home when I was lost in anger and hurt. The house stands solid and warm around me, its walls holding our complicated history, its future secure, its heart beating strong again with the sounds of family, of forgiveness, of second chances, of home. Finally, completely and forever home. Spring arrived, bringing with it a sense of renewal that mirrored the changes in our lives. The garden burst into color, with tulips and daffodils pushing through the rich soil that George had always lovingly tended. One Saturday morning, as I was pruning the rose bushes, Daniel joined me, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "Remember how Dad used to say gardens teach us patience?" he said, handing me a mug. We worked side by side for hours, clearing winter debris and preparing the soil for new planting. It was during this quiet companionship that Daniel shared he'd been offered a promotion at work, one that would require more travel. "I'm not going to take it," he said firmly. "I've spent enough time chasing the wrong things. Dean needs me here, and honestly, I need to be here too." In that moment, watching my son choose family over ambition, I felt the last remnants of my anger melt away, replaced by a mother's quiet pride. Dean's 8th birthday arrived, and we decided to throw him a party in the backyard. The first real celebration the house had seen in years. Daniel hung streamers from the porch while I baked a chocolate cake, following the same recipe I'd used for all of Daniel's childhood birthdays. When the backyard filled with laughing children and their parents, I noticed how naturally Daniel interacted with everyone, no longer the stressed, preoccupied man he'd been with Vanessa. Later, as Dean blew out his candles, he whispered, "I wish we could have parties here every day." The simple, heartfelt wish brought tears to my eyes. After the guests left, Daniel and I sat on the porch, watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. "He's happy here," Daniel said quietly. "Happier than I've ever seen him." We sat in comfortable silence, listening to the crickets begin their evening chorus, and I realized this was exactly what George had wanted for our family. This peace, this connection, this love. Summer brought heat waves and the much-anticipated construction of the treehouse. Daniel spent weekends carefully building it in the old oak tree where his own father had built one for him decades earlier. Dean would sit on the grass, watching with wide eyes, offering to hold nails and fetch tools. One particularly hot afternoon, as we all took a break with lemonade, Dean looked at his father and said, "This is the best summer ever." Daniel's eyes met mine over our grandson's head, and I saw the gratitude and love shining in them. Later, when Dean was helping me wash the glasses in the kitchen, he confided, "I like Dad better now. He laughs more." The simple observation struck me deeply. Children notice everything, and Dean had clearly noticed the transformation in his father, the return to the man he was always meant to be. The first anniversary of my return to the house approached, and with it came reflections on everything that had changed. Daniel had settled into his new life, dating his kind teacher friend Sarah, who Dean adored. The trust for Dean's future was securely in place, and the house felt more like a home than it had in years. One evening, Daniel asked if we could have a family dinner, just the three of us, to mark the occasion. He cooked George's famous spaghetti recipe, and as we sat around the dining table, the same one they'd tried to take from me, Daniel raised his glass. "To second chances," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "and to the strongest woman I know." Later, as I tucked Dean into bed in what was once his father's room, he hugged me extra tight and whispered, "Don't ever leave again, Grandma." I kissed his forehead, promising I never would. Fall returned, and with it came the bittersweet knowledge that our first full year of healing was complete. The trees around our property burst into brilliant shades of red and gold, and the air carried that crisp, apple-scented quality that George had always loved. Daniel and I began a new project together, scanning all the old family photos and creating digital albums for Dean. As we worked through boxes of memories, we found ourselves laughing and crying together, remembering the good times and acknowledging the difficult ones. One photo particularly stood out. George and a young Daniel building that first treehouse, both covered in sawdust and grinning. "He'd be proud of you," I told my son, "for finding your way back." Daniel hugged me then, a proper, heartfelt hug that healed something in both of us. Winter approached again, but this time it felt different, cozy and welcoming rather than bleak. Daniel, Dean, and I spent evenings by the fireplace, playing board games and reading stories. We started new traditions, like making Christmas cookies together and stringing popcorn for the tree. One snowy evening, as we watched a movie with hot chocolate, Dean fell asleep between us on the sofa. Daniel carefully carried him to bed, then returned to sit with me. "Thank you, Mom," he said quietly, "for fighting for us, for not giving up on me." We talked late into the night about the future, about plans for the garden, about Dean starting third grade, about everything and nothing. The house felt warm and full, not just with heat, but with the love that had returned to fill its rooms. The new year brought unexpected joys. Dean won an art contest at school, with a painting of our house, complete with the treehouse and garden. Daniel's relationship with Sarah grew more serious, and she began joining us for family dinners, fitting into our lives as if she'd always been there. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, Sarah mentioned how much she loved the house. "It feels like a real home," she said. "Like it's been loved for generations." Later, Daniel told me he was thinking about asking her to marry him. "I want what you and Dad had," he confessed. "Real love, not just convenience." Seeing my son understand the difference, valuing substance over surface, felt like the final piece of healing falling into place. Spring returned, and with it came the news that Daniel and Sarah were engaged. We decided to have the small wedding in the backyard, under the oak tree that had witnessed so much of our family's history. As we prepared the garden for the ceremony, I found Dean carefully arranging wildflowers in a vase. "For the new mom," he explained seriously. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful. When Daniel saw Sarah coming down the garden path, the look on his face was one of pure, real love, the kind George used to give me. As they exchanged vows under the tree, with Dean standing proudly as ring-bearer, I felt George's presence so strongly it was as if he were standing beside me, sharing this perfect moment. The years that followed brought more changes, all of them good. Sarah moved into the granny flat with Daniel, and eventually, a new granddaughter joined our family. Little Grace took her first steps in the same living room where her father and grandfather had taken theirs. The house continued to be the heart of our family, now filled with even more love and laughter. I often found myself watching the children play in the garden that George had planted, thinking how strange and wonderful life could be, how from the ashes of betrayal, something more beautiful than we could have imagined had grown. Today, as I sit on the porch watching my grandchildren play, I think about the extraordinary journey that brought me here. The pain of betrayal has faded, replaced by gratitude for the wisdom it brought. Daniel became the man his father always knew he could be. A loving father, a devoted husband, a good son. The house stands not as a monument to the past, but as a living testament to the power of forgiveness and the resilience of love. George's foresight protected our home, but it was love that saved our family. As the sun sets, painting the sky in familiar shades of orange and purple, I feel completely at peace. The journey was long and often painful, but it led us here, to this moment, this love, this home. And I know, with absolute certainty, that George is smiling.